And now it is my pleasure to welcome Dennis Corelli, who I have gotten to know after these last few years. And he is the town of Newcastle conservationist, is that it, or environmentalist? I'm not sure which term you use, Dennis.
I guess the title is environmental coordinator.
Environmental coordinator, who will graciously tell us about today's program. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. Hello, all. Hoping you could see the cover slide and hear me okay. So before we even advance the presentation, the 100 years, obviously we're tying that to the celebration of the 100 years for the Chappaqua Library. Well, truth be known, 2 years ago, before the world changed, we were looking to do a tree presentation to celebrate 50 years of Earth Day. And the original title for this presentation was something like 50 Trees, 50 Years. And what's represented in the photographs on the cover slide is the trees that we had planted at Glacier Preserve. Technically, they were planted towards the end of 2019, and 2020 was the 50th year anniversary for Earth Day. So presentation, which I never got to deliver, and I'm happy I have the opportunity to do so now. Remains pretty much unchanged, but is certainly still relevant today. And as you can see, we just happened to change the title. So I know that I've obviously met a few people as environmental coordinator during my time here in Newcastle, starting in June of 2019. And there's a few times I'm sure people have heard me reference my former life. And so my career began in 1988. I started working for an environmental engineering and consulting firm called Malcolm Perney. Some fellow Newcastle residents who I had the pleasure to work with, Mr. Dick Brownell, who's on the planning board, and residents who I haven't run into, Peter and Janine Wicko. All those folks are engineers. And as you can see from these photos, I'm not an engineer. So this was us in the 90s. Our group supported all of those engineering projects through either environmental permitting, environmental impact statements, environmental assessments. So as you can see, I spent a fair amount of time in the field. And yes, it used to be called Bring Your Daughters to Work Day in the 90s. I wanted to be historically accurate. I just heard on the radio, I think just this week, it was Bring Your Child or Children to Work Day. So I'm glad that we've advanced to include all of humankind. Next. And that's just a little more me in the 2000s. I wanted to point out, I guess, from this slide, I love that tree in the lower right-hand corner when we were doing a project for greening the Bronx and doing inspections on all the trees they planted. And if you wanted to see what that particular specimen looks like in all its glory, if you drive up towards 117 on 320 King Street, just turn your head to the right. And that tree, right now, it does not have its leaves, but when it produces its leaves, it's a pretty nice species, majestic, and it's near downtown. So I figured that's a good reference for everyone to sort of start and tie it into Chappaqua and Newcastle. Next. So speaking of the 100 years, I thought these were interesting proverbs with respect to, really, I know a lot of people, design and, look to obviously present landscape in the moment, but, you really could consider and should consider, when you're planting trees, it's something you hope that, those can enjoy and, provides, importance to wildlife and ecology beyond our lifetimes. And, I thought these two pretty much sum that up. I know the top, I believe that was from an African author. I think when I first saw the quote, they were trying to tie it to a Chinese philosopher. That's what I was able to verify. And the lower one, I'm not going to read because I probably won't do it justice, as I'm not, a great poetry reader. But it really does sort of emphasize that, you're giving to the next generation when you decide to plant a tree. And it would be, hopefully this presentation helps to sort of give that approach, in that it's not just, sort of a decision in the moment, or, to just infill something in a particular area or on a property. Next. So you get to the stage and you're thinking about, okay, what do I want to plant? Gee, I want to plant a tree. So you have to sort of take a step back and think about, well, what's the purpose? What's your purpose? And I obviously, coming more from an ecological background, I try to do my best to put myself into that landscaper role, landscape architect role, and that is certainly not my area of expertise. So a lot of people, I know, for example, on their properties, they want to, plant green screens, as they're called. So, in that consideration, you're going to be looking at the, leaves that are on sort of the top part of the slide. You're looking at an evergreen species that's going to, have its leaves, throughout the year, needles, if you will, and, to be able to block, whatever you don't want to see, or you don't want someone to look in and see you. The lower box is just a selection of various shaped deciduous leaves. And, those are considerations as well, not just, for the growing season, but obviously we're fortunate enough in this region to have a fall and, have really a quite dynamic fall. And so some of these species, some of the colors that they turn, if that's something that, you want to, consider within your landscape, that would be the consideration when you're thinking about a deciduous species. So you could, start anywhere, but I figure the leaves were a good place to start. Next, please. So this slide, it's interesting. I added this since 2020. This might be the only slide that I had added. And the reason I did was just recently, it was a comment from a neighbor, and it was for a planning board application. And they had a green screen proposed. And there was a comment that was asking, well, instead of having a more columnar form, could we plant something else that, has more of a spread, more pyramidal, something to that effect? So again, I trying to be sensitive to those that, are more in the landscape architecture. I decided to share this slide and just show some of the, different shapes of trees that, you could, review and consider if you were looking to plant. For myself, if I was looking to improve function from a ecological or wildlife perspective, I'm not going to care about this as much. I'm still going to be, more focused on species and their, nativity if they're native. But again, this is a tree planting presentation, and I just wanted to share this as another consideration if you, were looking to come to a process to decide, gee, how am I going to decide to plant what and where? Next, please. So I have to bring up the fruiting bodies. Some of these are kind of innocuous, like the maples. I haven't really run into anybody that's had issue looking to remove a maple because they're not fond of the seeds that, come spiraling to the earth when they're dropped later in the early, I guess, later spring, early summer. But I know people who have removed trees because of, what you see on the right, with the hickories and the oaks, everything from cars to having trouble sleeping in the fall. So, that would be really like a disservice to, if you have an opportunity to plant and you want to make sure that, that's something that doesn't happen, maybe even in your children's lifetime. So that would be a consideration as to where not to locate that tree. You wouldn't want to be near such things. I bring up the white pines. I happen to grow up with those. And the two things I could mention about that species is one, you will be cleaning the gutters more than once a year if they're anywhere near the overhang of the house, as I had to. And two, I just remember my mother not being happy with having a sticky patio from time to time and having to worry about scrub that out. And as far as the tupelo, those, as you could see, produce the berries. And I had someone that wanted to remove that tree. It was growing close to the home and kind of growing into the home, but they were also making mention of, the kids were actually slipping on the berries, like at the top of the driveway and on the steps. So again, just some considerations before you even go into the planting, as to, what may develop that, may end up being a situation you wish you avoided. Next slide, please. So I can't see my audience, so I'm not going to be too descriptive in what these particular species smell like to me. I know that when you look this up on the internet, especially with calorie pear, and in my opinion, I think hawthorn has a very similar smell when it flowers. The term malodorous is used, and that's probably good enough. I know not hawthorn so much, but I know calorie pear. It's a little controversial now because it's definitely A, it's not native, and B, it's found a way to kind of propagate and naturalize, or attempt to naturalize beyond its planted location. And so that's not beneficial, obviously, from that ecological perspective. And I just think from a landscape perspective, when this flowers, it has a nice look, but if it's too close or you're downwind of it, you're not going to be happy. And I know from the ginkgo, it's only the female of the species that produces the berries. And I know where I went to school at Marist College, we had one by the library. And whenever that was fruiting, it actually became a point where people just wouldn't even walk by it. I mean, that's how unpleasant the odor was when those berries would drop and hit the ground. Next slide, please. So another concept is, what time of the year would you consider planting trees? Now, I know it's popular. Spring and fall are the recommended times. But there are certain species that they're drawn to your attention to, that they're fall digging, as they put it here, and planting. So the digging is in relation to, that term is for when the nursery is basically taking a tree that's ready to be now dug up and balled and burlapped, to be delivered to the location of wherever it's going to be planted. So for example, in the case of Glacier Preserve, when we planted those trees in 2020, the nursery was in Buffalo. So, the tree is, traveling a distance, and it's also kind of, in this case, traveling to like another, sort of climate zone. So there are certain species that I guess, for the fall digging and planting, present a little bit more of a risk as opposed to if they were planted in spring. As you can see, what I highlighted here on this particular slide, red maple is a species that, was planted at Glacier, and I'll speak about that later as to how we did with the success of that. Next slide, please. And as you can see, I couldn't fit them all on one slide. So this was a continuation of some of the species that were called out for that special attention. And as you could see, 2 additional ones that happen to be on this list were also planted at Glacier in 2019. Next slide, please. So I guess this is a good opportunity. I was happy I found these quotes because they were almost like caveats. Everything is relative, right? So in this case, the good doctor from Cornell, her opinion is that, the list, that they're generalizations. And, it's interesting enough, in her opinion, that, that those species that just happen to appear on those lists, they could be more difficult to transplant, period. But it just so happens that the likelihood of survival for said difficult species seems to go up if it occurs, the planting, occurs in spring versus fall. That seems reasonable. I'm not sure I have a personal opinion one way or the other. I just know that was something that I feel was important to share. And I found the lower quote to be a little more humorous. That, if you look hard enough, you'll find nearly every species on someone's full hazard list. And so that got me to thinking, and I think I offer this to you, is if you've had difficulty with a species, and for whatever reason, on your property, and it's unknown, there's no need to fight it. It might be a good idea to try to come up with an alternative or select something else. Obviously, you're dealing with, biology and living organisms, and sometimes for whatever reason, they do great at point A, they don't do great at point B, and, there may not be a great difference based on observation or based on condition, but for whatever reason, the tree likes A and doesn't like B. So that's something to pay attention to if you have that experience. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at the planting location or the property and some of the considerations now that you're going to have to contend with, almost not limitations but considerations, I guess, as I put on the slide here. So one is, the term photo period. What's the level of daily exposure that this tree is going to have? Is it going to be planted in the middle of the lawn and there's nothing else around, so it's going to get a lot of exposure? Is it going to be near a wood line, or are you looking to put it as a tree underneath existing trees, but for understory purposes, that it's not going to, it's a species that won't get as tall as some of the other ones. So that's something that you would need to sort of observe what you have on your property and what the tree would require. I'm bringing up soil properties. I have a slide dedicated to that. Just to quickly summarize the texture, it refers to the physical classification of the soil. That's usually the sand, silt, and clay component. Then there's obviously the more chemical components, which are all the various nutrients that are important for growth and photosynthesis. In addition to some chemical adjustments for the pH level of the soil. Some folks look to adjust pH, or if the soil has a particular pH, and you need to sort of pay attention to that. And then there's an organic component, so that could vary. There are decomposing organics sometimes in soil. There could be a lot of organics on the surface. That's an indicator, sometimes of a potentially hydric or wetland condition. Then there's the species themselves, the trees themselves. They may have certain resistance. I bring up herbivory. Obviously people are familiar with deer. Deer prefer some more than others. Obviously, a starving deer will eat anything, but if they're not starving, they do have preferences to what their menu items would be. There's certain pests that attack certain species. Others, unfortunately, attack more than just a particular species. There's certain types of diseases that goes beyond, that's not speaking of pests, but, actually more fungal in nature. And then there's a physical damage component that we'll talk about. Some are more susceptible. And again, that may not affect the survival of a tree, but you may not be happy to look at something that is, doing just fine. But, branch breakage, for example, could be something that, that's just how the tree typically grows. And then I end with, on this list, and probably we'll end up talking, the most about in general, the hydrologic regime of, what the species prefers in terms of the level of water hydrology that is anticipated to be at a particular location. Some of that is driven by rainfall, but there's also, groundwater fluctuation. There's areas where water tends to accumulate more versus others. And then there's just the fact of life. Yes, it's a wetland. And, that's something that, yeah, you're going to have to plant, species that want to be wet tolerant, as opposed to, areas that are non-wetlands. And then the opposite obviously would apply. Next slide, please. So I figured we would start with photo period. So what I'm highlighting here is this particular species, hornbeam, or what I like to call the common name of musclewood. And it's interesting because that name applies for two features I find with the tree. One, if you're not familiar with this tree, and it does grow around Newcastle, I see it, the trunk, the bark, it's a thin bark tree, and it really does resemble, almost from like the Bodies exhibition, if you're familiar with that. Like if you could peel the skin away from your, pick arm, leg, whatever, and you're looking at, the actual tissue, it has the sinewness of the tissue in the bark. You could sort of pick that up. And also, if you grab or knock on the tree, it is a very hard wood. So I just find that, in that case, musclewood actually applies, for two features of the tree. So back to photo period. This particular tree was planted. This was a wetland restoration site at a Superfund site in in New Jersey near Philadelphia. And if you're looking through the tree, so you're looking to the background, you'll notice two things. On the lower portion of the tree, you'll see a lot of brown. That's the grass that's gone to seed, because we used to do our monitoring in October. And if you look through the leaves, you'll see that it's fairly open beyond the leaves, and that's the sky. And there was a tidal creek behind that. And that sort of gives the impression that, that area, receives a lot of sun. And it does, because unfortunately, that's where a lot of the contamination was. And so whatever trees were there had to be removed. And if you look to the foreground of the tree, you'll see some streaks of sun coming through. To that side was where we were able to leave more of a mature forested canopy. And you could see the sunlight is just peeking through as opposed to getting full sun. Well, I could tell you all the trees that we planted in the back that were, American hornbeams did not do well and or died. And the ones that, this one sort of represents this zone of transition, and all the other ones to the front of it did quite well. So, that obviously became a bit of a lesson learned that, we needed to pay more attention to the photo period of this species at that particular restoration site, because, the full sun did not do these trees justice at the end of the day. Next slide, please. So when I was originally practicing this presentation in front of my wife, the minute this slide popped up, she said, "This is a very busy slide." I said, "Well, that's the point." And she says, "Well, then don't spend a lot of time on it." So the purpose of me sharing this is that I feel that trees have a fair amount of variability to be able to grow in different types of soil. And, my experience has been, in Chappaqua, as long as you can get past rock, and, in the Northeast in general, as long as you could avoid the coastal areas, we tend to have the classifications that, you see wherever the word loam appears. And those classifications, as I said, they're based on the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. And that texture triangle is, in essence, these have to be sent to a lab to determine, what the percent composition is of sand, silt, and clay. It's done kind of like through this sieve analysis, and there's different size sieves, and whatever passes through, the larger sieve, but not the smaller sieves, that's your sand component. And then, in the middle would be your silt component. And then what's able to pass through all the pore sizes to the smallest pore size and or the bottom, that would be your clay component. And, nobody's going to do that. Now, I don't expect people to do that. So again, I just bring this up, just to sort of educate as to, what you're considering in soil. But I don't feel that there's that much that you need to do or have to do with the terms of the texture for planting a tree. I bring up the nutrients, just again, to sort of educate. You have the, essential nutrients, and, broken down as macro, secondary, micro, and those are all the symbols from the periodic table of elements. Again, if you were looking to determine those concentrations, that's a lab analysis, and, we're not looking for that, when it comes to planting a tree. I'd just like to point out what I kind of, with respect to the detritus and the topsoil, what defines the detritus is like, right? It's the whole kitchen sink. It's the leaves, it's the plant parts, it's animal remains, it's waste products, it's organics, and, all coming into either soil or bodies of water, from the surrounding community. And as you could see at the bottom, where I put the number 1, topsoil is formed and maintained only through continual additions of this detritus. So, I know that you may have heard some upcoming programs like No Mow May, and, people who leave the leaves. These are some of the reasons why that, you're asked to do that. It's nice when, the grass goes to seed and it's able to drop its seed particles. It's okay that, there's a certain level of leaves that stay on the lawn and then continue to decay, because you're actually, forming important nutrients, forming, topsoil. And, we don't have to go running to Home Depot to buy bags of this and just reapply it. It's all there for you. You could do with what you have. Next slide, please. So in speaking of the resistance, I guess the herbivory, when I think of the mammal component, deer and rabbits obviously, contribute to that. And, not only in terms of eating, but, there, I think this is about the time of the year, maybe a little earlier, where you might notice some of the smaller size trees, and it looks like, somebody took a weed whacker to the trunk. Those are the deer that are, looking to rub off the velvet of their antlers, from winter, and they could do a number on trees. So they're not necessarily eating it, but they're not doing it any favors either by the physical damage that occurs. Some of the insects, some of which battles are lost, the emerald ash borer, there's no recovery from that at a species level. Unfortunately, once, happens more to mature specimens, but once they're infected, there's no turning back. That tree is going to die. This Asian hemlock woolly aldehyde, that takes time. I know some people may notice. I think it's like the white ick almost that you see sort of on the needles. But I've seen trees live for a fair amount of time with that on them. It's just something that you can treat if you wish, and not necessarily leading to the a rapid demise as opposed to the emerald ash borer. That Asian longhorn beetle, it unfortunately affects a number of species of hardwoods, so it varies its menu, and I know that's a problem in NYC and Long Island. And I bring up this nematode species because that is what's causing, I guess, like a beech leaf disease is what's known as that, which is different from beech bark disease. So unfortunately, the beeches are getting double bit there. This nematode actually occurs in the leaves and in the vein patterns of a beech leaf, in between the lines. You'll notice if the tree is infected, there's like these different color patterns. So for example, a green leaf, it may be all green, but it'll be, the intensity or hue of that green would be different. So in a healthy leaf, it would be, more of a darker green, but then all of a sudden, if you see something a little bit paler and it's, alternating almost with the darker green, that's a sign that, that tree is now under, an early infection from this particular nematode. The diseases, cankers, those are sort of like these large, polyp type things that you might see on barks of trees. And sometimes they actually, form to where there's actually leakage. So you might even see, either actual fluid coming out or, sort of that drip pattern, if it's dried, of where it did come out, those are a problem. Apple scab specifically affects, like apple trees, crab apples. There's a few species that you can, on the leaves, you get these rust and powdery mildews. And again, these are all caused by, particular fungi, however you like to pronounce that. Some of these can be treated, with various sprays. Those seem to have more of a landscape application than, again, looking to run around the woods and do something like this. And then to the physical damage. So some shallow rooted species are more inclined to, I don't want to make this sound like that it's a fait accompli. They're just more inclined to maybe tip and uproot, if they're exposed to high winds. I know that, people have probably seen spruces, Norway in particular. That's a possibility, but obviously there's a number of Norways that are still standing. So I don't want to, pick on that species in particular. And I know it's planted and fairly popular, but that's just to give an example of one thing that could happen. And then, the breakage of the branches. So there are some deciduous species that, are softer wood. Maple is one of them. And, they may just break, but that doesn't mean the tree is in trouble. You could prune that, if you wish, and, the tree will be fine. And then, speaking the heavy sap, that's more of a white pine. That's a species that likes to drop and break branches. And, those could be a little bit more of a concern because, we have a lot of mature white pines. And I think that was a widely popular plant back in the day when houses were being constructed. I think because it was cheap. And when it's in its younger form, it definitely serves as a green screen. But as the tree grows and matures, it's not a green screen anymore. And so, you know, some of them may end up a little bit closer to houses or driveways than, you know, people would like. And especially after, which I know I've issued a number of permits for, it's after the roof repair, it's after the car has come back from the auto body shop, and it's understandable, you know, why someone doesn't want to, you know, assume this risk going forward with a particular specimen. Next slide, please. So to speak to the hydrology, as I say, this is the key for me. And these are the 5 indicators that you will find on the National Wetland Plant List indicator ratings. And as the wetland scientist, you know, I've spent a lot of time, you know, doing delineations, and you know, when you catalog, you know, the dominant species, you need to find out what their indicator status, because that helps to promote whether you're going to call an area a wetland or a non-wetland. And these have been developed, you know, starting in the 80s by an author, Reed, and have since been updated. I happen to have a hand copy here with me. I don't know if you could see on camera. So this is like my little pamphlet going back to the early 90s, which Reed sort of helped develop. And now there is, I think there may even be another version of this, but this is the National Wetland Plant List indicator status. And again, these 5 classifications, just so that we're clear, you know, understand they were developed because there was a lot of time spent in wetlands, not necessarily non-wetlands. And as it says here, each plant species was assigned a rating representing the estimated probability or frequency with which it is thought to occur in wetlands, as opposed to non-wetlands across its entire range. So I start that as the caveat as I run down and begin with the obligate species, which, you know, that is something that, you know, you're going to find in wetlands. And as far as trees, the best example I could think of, I don't know of any around here. I know we encountered them in Vineland, New Jersey, Atlantic white cedar and cedar swamps. That particular species is, you know, an obligate tree species. Facultative wetland species, those are usually found in wetlands, but it says occasionally found in uplands. To go over some examples of those species, river birch or red birch is one, but I do see that planted in landscapes that I would not describe as wetlands. Pin oak is another species. Pin oak is a popular street tree species. So, you know, I'm bringing up these anomalies because, you know, and again, based on the statement that I just read, you know, what you encounter in nature, that's how these, you know, indicator status are assigned to particular species. But again, you know, thank heaven for biology, and, you know, thank heaven for variability. It's not exclusive. And if, you know, something can work in another landscape, if it's nursery raised and planted, then, you know, we don't necessarily have to use this as gospel, but I still think it's important to consider, you know, what we're going to, you know, go over here a little bit in the future slides for the hydrology. The facultative species, they're equal. Red maple is the best example I can come up with. Turner Swamp Sanctuary is a red maple hardwood swamp. That would be its ecological classification according to ecological communities in New York State. But at the same time, you see a lot of red maples growing in non-wetlands. You see a lot of red maples planted on properties that are doing fine. So that's an example of a species that, you know, really, you know, can do well one way or the other. Facultative upland species, ones that a lot of people would be familiar with, a number of the hickories and some of the oaks. White oak is one, red oak would be another. And then the upland species, those are the ones that you would, you know, really see just in uplands. The one that I can think of off the top of my head is chestnut oak. And I see that, you know, at the highest reaches of Glacier if you walk those trails. And I've also found it in the upper area of Sunny Ridge, and that's a great tree. So next slide, please. So to give an example in town, you know, where this sort of played out. So what we're looking at here, this is the area that is off of Roaring Brook Road, that is sandwiched between Roaring Brook Road and the parking lot, I'll say, of Lifetime Fitness, or as I like to call it, Intergalactic Fitness. And the Chappaqua Crossing Retail Project did some supplemental plantings in this area amongst the mature overstory that still remains where the trees are still standing. And so in this case, beech, this is American beech. These are two different specimens, and this is considered a facultative upland species. It's classified as that. So therefore, it's more likely to be found in non-wetlands than wetlands. So I'm glad that I returned to take the photos in the upper part of the slide, because the week before I noticed that there was an area around the tree of standing water. And I returned and took the photo, and I'm glad that I did, because this helps to sort of give indicators on a property, for example, where you may have water that tends to pond, or soils that might be a little more saturated versus just standing water. And in this case, if you look at the soil, there is a look, a coloration that to me, just sort of exhibits that, it was wet or could have been wet. And then more importantly, in looking at the leaf litter, you could see that there's like a stainage, like a discoloration, more than just, the leaves have fallen and are turning brown, as if, they were sitting in water or underwater, and then some of the fines that were probably kicked up and put into, sort of suspension as a result of being in a muddy environment. On the resettling, you see it sort of stains the leaves. So this particular specimen, it's the same photo, the two photos represent the same tree. It didn't survive. When I took the photo in the bottom picture, I literally turned around 180 degrees. I didn't even move my feet. And as you could see, not only is this tree upslope, and this photo was taken in March, so those are not dead leaves. Beech has a tendency, oaks do as well. They retain their leaves. They don't necessarily go all bare like some other deciduous species. You could see that it is not only planted upslope, but if you look at the ground surface, you look at that leaf litter. That's in essence what it is. It looks like maybe what you would rake on your front lawn and go jumping in with the family and the dog afterwards. It obviously gets wet. It obviously is subject to precipitation events, but there's not this ponding. So that is maybe an indicator that if you want to just sort of glance or gloss over the surface of a property to try to find some of those key indicators as to, gee, is water ponding here potentially, or is it does it drain fairly well, either superficially or through the ground. Next slide, please. And so this is an example. I know I mentioned some earlier of sort of those exceptions. So hemlocks, which when I've seen them growing, not just in Newcastle, but through my experience, the facultative upland, or FAC up, is a, I think, accurate designation for this tree. But here in and I'm sorry, because I'm going to show you an older version. I think this was updated in 2014, but in the ecological communities of New York State, there is a hemlock hardwood swamp, and it's dominated by this tree, and doesn't really have much else growing. So again, nature throwing another curveball, or at least trying, us trying to, categorize nature. I would still say, because this dynamic exists, if someone were to ask me, Dennis, I want to try to plant hemlocks in my wetlands, what do you think? And I'm like, well, my caveat and caution would be, if you're looking to get trees from a nursery, unless they're grown in this type of condition, I would be hesitant, and I don't think you would have a high degree of success, because they are FAC up trees, and that's how they're going to be sort of reared and raised. And if you're going to get one in that fashion, and it's been cared for its whole life in that, to that point in a nursery, it's not going to make it in your wetland. That would be my opinion. If you wanted to take a trip to I'd have to see exactly where this is in New York State. I know it's north of here. And if you wanted to, dig up a specimen and, pot it and travel home and give it a shot in your wetlands, that would be a different approach. And, you may have more success because the tree at least, had got started in this environment. Next slide, please. So in the case of, as I had mentioned, when we planted the trees at Glacier, I used the hydrology approach or the hydrology classification wetland plant indicator rating approach to help me make a decision as to where I was going to plant these trees. And these trees, as you could see maybe on the invoice, I know it's not the greatest copy. Steve Coleman, my predecessor, had ordered these. And I was at the job for less than a month and he handed me this list and he said, these trees are coming in the fall. You have to figure out where to plant them at Glacier. And I'm like, okay, what's Glacier? So that's how much knowledge I had at that point. And as you could see, these trees, we got 50 of them, 25 were through the New York Power Authority's, tree power program. You buy one, get one free. So they give you 25 and we grabbed 25. And so what I did was I looked up these species and wrote down in my notes what the wetland plant rating was. And just to point out the exception, the malus, the crab apples, those were not indicated or not rated on the plant list. So the way I interpreted that from my experience is the trees that I have found that don't make it to the list that has been compiled, as the National Wetland Plant Rating List. And again, that list, I should have said earlier, that includes shrubs, that includes herbs, that includes sedges, rushes, grasses. So it includes, thousands of plants. When I find that, plants are not on that list, I don't expect to find them in wetlands. I don't think they prefer wetlands. So for this particular species, I was thinking I've got to find a non-wetland location. Next slide, please. So the way that anybody, and I think the easiest way to do this, frankly, to look up that, wetland plant rating indicator is to go to this website. And I had to update the website 2020 when I attempted the link because that was the older slide. It didn't work. So this is updated. And the good old USDA National Resources Conservation Service plant database, you could look up all these plants. And what's nice is that, unlike the book that I referenced before, the printout of the National Wetland Plant List, you need to know all the Latin. Well, here, there are opportunities to have a search function. And as you could see in the upper left-hand and right-hand side of the slide, that you could do common name, or you could do the scientific name. And so in this case, I decided to, as an example, use white pine, one of the trees we had to plant at Glacier. And so when you click on the Go button, the screen that is in the upper hand left is what would appear. And it shows, there's the nice Mercator projection of the United States, and it shows, in green, the region that it likes to grow. And it has some other information, in a box in screen, and then it has tabs up above. And if you click on the wetland tab, you end up getting the box that I highlighted on the lower right. And for us, we're looking at, the north central northeast region. As you could see, the US, has been divided into 5 regions. And yes, sometimes the plants do have a different indicator status in a different region. So, it's not necessarily uniform throughout the United States. So in this case, we knew that this confirmed that, white pine was a FAC-up tree. Again, you may visit this site for a particular species that you're interested in. Could be trees, could be anything. And if you don't see that wetland tab, then it doesn't have, wetland indicator status. So you will proceed with that information as however you see fit. Next slide, please. So then came, obviously the part where I'm like, okay, I got to find out what Glacier is and, where there may be opportunity to plant trees. So I did have the good fortune, to be compensated to hike Glacier to figure out, where we're going to do plantings. And I noticed that, Glacier has a lot of mature woodlands. And so, and accessing some of those mature woodlands, through these trails, which is wonderful for hiking. But I'm like, gee, how are we going to get, a big bald and burlap tree and a contractor and, and is it necessary to, because I felt, we have a mature woods. So what we ended up settling on was right, near the entrance, which, on this particular trail map, you could see is, sort of that red dot, and then behind it, that light blue and yellow dot, near the parking lot and the, I guess the kiosk area for Glacier. You see, sort of that brown area. If you look, below the red, it kind of has a, it's squared off at a right angle, and then, it has the blue trail that kind of encloses it. That was a, an open meadow area. I thought that, kind of represented a good upland area that we could, supplement some trees, not necessarily just cover it in trees. And the other was looking more at the light blue and yellow box, kind of going up top of the page. There's a small rectangular depression. It happens to be next to the wetland area. And I had also heard from some of the Parks and Rec staff that area is difficult to go in, and which they haven't done and really don't need to do too often, cut and mow, because it gets a little bit wet. And I'm like, well, it's a rectangular depression. It's off of Whippoorwill Road, and it's got a road drainage. I'm sure it gets a little bit on one side. It's got a wetland to the other. I'm going to, cite trees that like it to be a little bit wetter in that location. Next slide, please. So in that particular slide, that's just a photo of, generally the two areas, just to orient for anyone who wants to visit Glacier. So you could see, where the kiosk message board is. That hillside is to the backside of that kiosk, and the trail you could see to the right in the photo. That's the blue trail. And then the area that's pointed to in the on the photo on the right hand side of the slide, that is something you will see after you park the car and get out of the car and look towards towards I would say Whippoorwill Road and back towards 117. That's where that depression is. Next slide, please. So these are the trees when they were delivered in November 2019. As I'm not sure if the scale comes through, but these are not small trees. I mean, they had to be offloaded with an excavator and a chain, to sort of wrap around the wire baskets that made the actual ball. We certainly weren't going to do it to the trunk of the tree because that would cause damage, and kind of move them to that side of the parking area as a staging area. And how we would have got that up into the woods of Glacier and up those slopes, it would have been a test. And I'm glad that those areas didn't need to have trees planted. Next slide, please. So one area, what I guess we can call now the Pine Pocket. This area was upslope on that meadow and looking back towards Whippoorwill Road. So the row of more mature spruces that you see in the background, just behind that is Whippoorwill Road to orient you. And, there are evergreens growing there. So, and there are mature white pines that are out of camera view and to the left. So, there's a twofold advantage in my opinion. One, obviously, hydrologically, I felt that this tree would be comfortable as a backup tree in this location. But two, it doesn't hurt to cheat, if you want to call it that. And that's what I call it, because the site has communicated to me, there's a lot of evergreens here. You got mature pines growing here. I think this would be a good area for pines. I'm not going to fight what a site is telling me. I'm not going to fight biology. I know we're at the top of the food chain. I really don't worry about that. I just let biology sometimes dictate to me, and I think that's the way to go. And to illustrate, in the lower right hand photo, The pine tree that you see that is closest, that is not a planted tree. That was naturally recruited from the pines that were already existing there. It got mulched by the tree planting contractors. That's why it has that look. But the ones that have more of that ball shape in the background, those are the ones that we actually planted. So again, you know, you have natural recruitment going on in the area. Why not plant the pines? Next slide, please. I didn't have that advantage with the sugar maples in terms of the quote unquote cheating, but you know, I know that, you know, they like it dry, and I figured at the top of the slope, why not? And as you could see where the transition occurs, if you see at the left-hand side of the photograph in the slide, that's kind of where the pines had ended, and we're just moving across the slope. And this would be much clearer in view if you were walking the blue trail into the park and you turned your head to the left. You would see the sugar maples. Next slide, please. The crab apples, I probably took a little bit more of a landscape architect view, because I said, you know, gee, it would be nice maybe to, you know, have a row of trees that would, you know, flower in the spring and produce fruits in the fall, you know, so close to the visitors. And so, you know, again, with the help of the Conservation Board, which I'm sorry I neglected to say earlier because it was on the slide that they helped to select the locations of these trees. I apologize for not giving earlier credit verbally. We decided to go with an LA of crab apples. They're still there today. And last year we did some supplemental plantings for trees that I guess arrived prior to my starting with the town in 2018 and were stored, quote unquote, at Warburg Park. Some were kind of still in their original root balls. They were partially planted, buried, partially covered. And so, you know, we had some concerns that they may not make it much longer. So we happened to have 5 crab apples we had to leave behind based on their condition, but 5 we got to take with us, and we planted them right behind, moving towards the right of the photo, in staggered fashion. So in between the spaces of these 10 crab apples. And then behind that, we were able to plant another nice sized sugar maple that, you know, based on my last visit to Glacier just yesterday, is doing great. So that worked out. We were glad to get those extra trees in. The others you may notice, that's where all the newer plantings are at the train station. That's where all the remaining trees had been planted. And one cherry in the Pocket Park, which I was happy to see when I drove by today, is actually producing flowers. So I'm glad that that made it as well. And one cherry in front of Town Hall, which not the weeping cherry, which also seems to be doing well. I'm happy to hear, because there's not always success in that double transplant, so to speak. Next slide, please. And there's my double depression of the sycamore and red maples. Sycamore is fac wet, and red maple, you know, is a facultative species. You know, can do well equally in either location. But you know, I've seen it in swamps. It does like swamps, so I wasn't too concerned. And so, you know, if I had to tally, these were 50 trees that we planted. And, you know, obviously other things need to work in order for, you know, me to proudly say what, you know, I'm about to say in terms of success. We have one sugar maple that I think long-term survival I'm going to question. We have one sycamore that I'm going to make the same comment about, and maybe one other sycamore that may not come into full form as soon as some of the other trees. And that's it. So, you know, to achieve greater than a 90% survival rate at this point, you know, going into year 3, I think, you know, obviously you have to give landscape contractor credit. You have to give the nursery credit for stock. I don't want to, you know, put that aside, but, you know, it's important to really pay attention to some of these other considerations. And the case in point for the photos that we're looking at now, I had gone into this area and did some of my own clipping. You know, there were some species of multiflora rose and wineberry and honeysuckle. And I was just looking to get those out of there so it would be easier for the contractor, to sort of access and get in and out to plant these trees. Similar to the meadow, where we put the crab apples and the sugar maples, the town used a brush hog to do a mowing to sort of get rid of, a lot of the blackberry that was growing, because again, we needed to have access to plant those trees. Well, when I was doing the hand removals here in the Depression Duo, I was finding small, dead, they look like they were Norway spruces. And I think, we must have made an attempt at some point, because there are Norway spruces in the parking lot that you'll notice when you park your car against the wood guide rail. And maybe there were extras that we decided to plant. And Norway spruce does not like wet feet, so there was an attempt, okay, we had extras, let's, possibly, I'm just speculating. And, the tree wasn't set up to survive, based on hydrologic regime. You could have had all those other things that I just mentioned being perfect. The nursery stock was fine. The contractor did a wonderful job. The tree was cared for, but, the hydrology, not getting enough water and too much water, it probably is the fastest way to kill a tree aside from vandalism. So I stick by this, as to sort of what my approach and what my methods are, in terms of trying to, foster growth. Next slide, please. So some of the other programs I wanted to highlight, because I guess I know that, I was put on the calendar to give this presentation for Earth Month. So speaking of the Great Glacier Preserve, our own Missy Fable of the Conservation Board this Saturday between 10 and 11 is going to do a tree walk. So you're happy to, go out and see some of the specimens that we recently planted, as well as a lot of other much older individuals. And, Missy will be able to guide you through that. I think that'll be a great event. And I think the weather's supposed to be okay from my last forecast check. Next slide, please. And then continuing at Gedney, Missy is not conducting this, but I put her as the contact because I believe she helped to sort of liaison with Mr. Lataka, who I've never met. I've only heard about. And as you could see, we're moving away in some cases from the plant kingdom and moving into, I think fungi has now been made its own kingdom, as well as mosses and lichens. And that's going to be on Sunday, April 24th, between 10 and 11:30. So I think that's something else that would be enjoyable as well, and hopefully the weather holds out for something that great. I think that concludes my my presentation at this point, and I don't know how best to field questions, but I'm happy to do so as long as I get a little bit of help.
Okay. Sounds good. As it turns out, I can see the Q&A on my screen, but Carrie can. So she will ask the Q&A questions, okay? I think she said there is one now.
Oh, great.
It's just a question asking if this is going to be recorded, and yes, it is.
Oh, okay.
It should be up by the weekend.
And
All
is there any additional request to have my face blacked out? I would not be insulted by that because, I can be a distraction. I'm sorry.
We do have another question of what is the biggest threat to trees in town?
Dendrophobia. That is the fear of trees. That is a real word. And me, who receives tree permit applications and receives an influx of folks that didn't grow up around trees, and I've read articles on this as well, your risk reward analysis is very different if you grew up in Westchester, grew up around trees, grew up with a tree that was within 10 feet of your house, and don't think of it as impending doom, as opposed to someone, who grew up in an apartment, or grew up in, any of the 5 boroughs and didn't have that. And the minute they get here, there's just sudden concern about all the trees that are, close to the residents. And, even before worrying about having an arborist evaluate the trees, if it falls, what if? And, I know that that's a possibility, obviously, but, I leave my house every day in my car and I don't go, what if, the person who's, on the other side of the road decides to cross the yellow and wants to kill me, So I think that to me is the biggest concern that I have. And insurance companies have not helped. New homeowners have moved in and they've shared the letters with me where the insurance company, and they are wording it very carefully, that they will not insure or renew insurance unless the overhanging branches, the overhang of the canopy is cleared from, what's over the roof. And the insurance company benefits from A, kind of putting that fear in them, and B, not necessarily clarifying, because from their purpose, it's like, well, if I just trim the tree, right here near the base of the ground, then great, nobody has to worry about it anymore. But yeah, you just cut out the tree. So that's my honest answer. That's what I think. I think it is more so than worrying about pesticides, worrying about, the diseases, worrying about weather, worrying about Hurricane Sandy, is its loss from property owners, private property owners.
Anything else, Carrie? Any other questions? Well,
If
I think,
anyone- Yeah, if anyone else is interested, just type your question in the Q&A box.
also, I just want to mention to everyone that the town's going to be giving us a tree, right, for our centennial? Dennis?
As long as we can nail that down, between you, I verified that today. I'm like, good, okay.
Got our fingers crossed that we could get it. We had to, when we had the addition, we had some to re-landscape, and I think we need some more trees. So
Okay,
we're thrilled. I mean, we're just so thrilled. So I'll expect to hear from you about this soon.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay. Carrie, I've got to thank you so much for stepping in, and it's your night off and you stayed with us the whole time. Thank you very much. We really thank you. And thank, of course, Dennis, who's done a great job. At this point, I know more about trees. I'm obligate and all those wonderful terms that sound so easy on my tongue. So thank you so much for this help. And Dennis, and we put this together. It's been going on for a long time to try to get this all pulled together. And it was a great presentation. And I hope that the community will all participate in taking care of their trees and watching their trees and planting more trees. They do clean the air besides everything else. That's one of the things that trees do. They clean the air. So we do want to have fresh air as much as possible. So I thank
Absolutely.
all of you for coming. And
Thank you.
we hope to see, this is a recorded program. So if you've missed something or want to write down something that Dennis might have said that you need, please go to our website, which is chappaqua.library.org, and you'll be able to rerun this whole program. It'll be up in about a week. This program will be no problem. Just scroll down on our homepage and you will see it. Okay, thank you all and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.